Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Today is a very, very exciting day, momentous, some might say, because this is our first day on the new learning platform. We're so happy that you could be here with us for the first webinar. You are going to be learning from your grant rejections, and this can be presented by Diane Leonard. So we will get going. I just got some new instructions for you so you know how to kind of move around on this platform. My name is Brooke Warrington. I'm the Training and Development Specialist at the Native Learning Center. As usual, we are so excited that you're on here with us today. If you could follow along while I read the disclaimer aloud. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. We also have our copyright infringement law printed here. So just a friendly reminder that the webinar materials are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws. All right, so we got some new lingo to learn on this new platform. So know that your live webinars are going to be called virtual classes. So once you log on to the learning platform, you will be able to see this green banner that goes across the top of your screen when a webinar is happening. All you got to do is click on that green banner and it'll take you directly into the webinar itself. So with this new system, you've registered already, and that's really all you have to do. Now you just kind of have to keep track of what days we have our webinars, we send out our e-blasts, and as long as you log in and see that green banner, you will be able to join. You just got to join at the webinar time. The first screen you're going to see, just like you saw today, it's going to have you do a little listening test. We are going to ask that you select to listen only as opposed to turning on your mics, just because we want to avoid any audio feedback while we're going through. But we do, of course, love your participation. We do want you to interact during our webinars. So we have a few ways you can do that on this platform. So if you look all the way over to your left, you will see a public chat. So if you want to participate in that, you'll just click on that public chat that's in the gray menu bar, and it'll open up a panel where you can see send message to public chat. You'll just type in whatever it is you want to send out and then hit enter, or you can click on that little arrow in blue and it'll send it in. Then over here in the middle, you can see down on that kind of blue bar menu at the very bottom of the screen, there's a little mic icon. That's how you can mute yourself when you come on if you are unmuted. And then all the way over to the right, we do have a hand raise feature available. So if at any point you've maybe sent a question into the chat and you're worried it's getting missed, you could maybe raise your hand just to draw attention to it, anything like that. And then this program actually has this really fun thing where you can set a status that everybody can see when they look at the users list. So if you wanted to set a status for yourself, you would just click on your name in the users list, and it would pop up this menu where you see to set status. If you click on that, it's going to pull down this menu where you can signal that you're away. You could raise your hand here as well. You could show that you're undecided, maybe a little confused, sad, happy. You could show some applause, thumbs up, thumbs down. Just a few different ways you can interact with today's webinar. All right, and then a quick final note, folks. So we did learn that if you click over on that red menu bar for the full website that's off to the left, bright red, if you click on that, it will automatically pull you out of today's webinar, and it will take you back to your dashboard or your home screen. You would be able to join it right back again. You would just be able to go ahead and click on that green banner, but I just want to give you a heads up. If you click on that red menu bar, you will be taken out of the webinar itself. So just try to avoid that if you can. All right, guys. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Diane Leonard, and y'all are here for learning from our grant rejections. Diane, I'm going to make you presenter now, and you can take control.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brooke. We're, I think, as nervous-sighted as you and your team are about today's session. New tech is always fun, exciting. Gives me the same sort of jitters as I think the days when we are clicking submit on very large grant applications. It's like the same sort of vibes. So thrilled to be with everyone today on your new platform, and to be talking today about how do we learn from, how do we grow from our grant rejections. I am so excited to be talking with you about, well, all things grants. That is actually my favorite thing to talk about. That, along with project management, Those are my two favorite things. And here's just a little bit about me on the screen in case you weren't part of any of the webinars that I did this past year. So I am a GPC, which means I'm a Grant Professional Certified, and I'm also an approved trainer through the Grant Professionals Association. Unfortunately, neither of those things protects me from grant rejections. Those still can happen. Yet to find any particular combinations of certifications, tools, skills that absolutely protect us from that hurt of a grant rejection. If you find something, do please let me know. There's a few things, though, that I think are important on the slide, more than just credentials and different professional background items. I think that our work is really hard when we talk about writing grants, seeking grants for our organizations and our communities. And because rejection is part of our work, let's think about what do we do for our self-care, for our team care, for our organizational care so that we can be sustainable in this work. And for me, that is running or cycling some days instead, and one good, strong, fresh cup of coffee. So both of those things have happened today. So I'm feeling rejuvenated and ready, even though I got a rejection on Friday that had me feeling a little sad. Yesterday, we got an award letter, so that balances life right back out again. Now, here's what I would love to do to help get you settled in, checked into this new fantastic system. If you could please, in the public chat, the very bottom of the column on your screen that says public chat, there should be a spot that says send message to public chat. If you could please type into that space, if you are so willing, how long have you been working with grants? Any unit of time. Doesn't mean that you are full-time. It could be part-time. It could be volunteer. It could be leadership for the organization, so you're overseeing it. But let's just make sure we've got folks here and able to get to that chat feature so that you can ask questions during the session. If you could please type into the public chat box, how long, some unit of time, have you been working with grants? All right, starting to get some responses. That's fantastic. Now I get to know a little bit about you, but also this is where at any time during our conversation today, you can enter a question. Any moment, anytime I'm on a slide, you have a comment, you have a question, right back to this public chat spot. Now, Brooke did also highlight that there are some really cool status items that you can set, and you could raise your hand. You're welcome to do that as well. If you'd like to do that as the way that you'll flag you have a question. I'm totally open to either. I'm watching for both. And yes, I do have a formal Q&A time set aside at the end of our 90 minutes together. But I'm of the belief that if you have a question while I'm on a particular slide, I'd love for you to ask the question right then, rather than wait, try to remember what the question was. Let's just try to talk about it right in the moment. All right, so we have a wide range of experience. Hi, Georgette, good to see you. 35 years. I should pass you the mic. You could go ahead and share some things with us too. And Michelle, good to see you. 8 years. Maggie with 7. Lisa with 7. We've got, like I said, a wide range of experience. And so when we talk about how we learn from rejections, how is it that we use it to actually build future success? I'm guessing some of you in the room have some thoughts and ideas as well. So I welcome your comments in this public chat box as well. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, yes, rejection, but we're going to really think about it from a place of success. And so I did bring my yellow dingy bell. Hopefully you can see that on my video. I brought this little yellow smiley bell that we like to ring when all sorts of good things happen. And I think the lessons that we learn, even after a rejection, can often be a reason for celebration in the very near future for an organization. So where I want to start is looking at not our rejection letters, not quite yet. We've got to warm it up before we start to talk about those ouch letters and emails we might get. I want to think about our work as a whole. I think grants can be stressful. In fact, our team's tagline is "Don't let grants stress you out." That's why, I can't even reach it back there. I've got a red stress ball that's supposed to be right at hand, tucked behind my bookshelf. good in those stressful moments, we can try and de-stress. I'm not sure how stressed you personally get about grants, but having polled many grant writers, grant seekers, nonprofit professionals who write grants over the years, feel pretty confident saying that at different times, grants cause a lot of stress for the individuals writing them, for the individuals providing information for them, and, well, honestly, for the grant reviewers too. But it's a stressful thing. Organizations need grant funds in order to do your great work. There's a lot of pressure on our shoulders in order to secure grant funds. Now, as we think about what is a stressor in our work versus potentially it could happen, we could make a mistake that could lead towards a rejection. I wanted to talk about some of the differences so that when we're having a day where we're like feeling a little angsty over grants, we can think about what is it that we're feeling? Is there a process change we want to make that might overall make us stronger, maybe minimize our rejections? So to do that, well, currently I'm in far, far upstate New York in the Thousand Islands, and it is unseasonably warm. It's 72 degrees on October 1st. I whisper with trepidation because I don't know when it's going to start snowing, but hopefully not today, not at 72. But this photo on the screen, this is also the Thousand Islands, but in a different time of year. This is the Coast Guard icebreaker going through the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence River is the international boundary between New York State and Canada. And this is the Canadian Coast Guard cutter that comes through on that international line. Has anyone ever seen an icebreaker either in person or maybe a video on YouTube or on Instagram or somewhere where you've seen the big ships that go through and cut through the ice so that large ships can get through? Could you let me know in the chat box why for yes and for no? Has anyone ever seen this? I did not grow up in this region, and so I was very much an adult when I saw this for the first time. And one, I was like, wow, those are big ships. Two, oh my goodness, that's really loud. I did not anticipate the noise of what it would sound like as this big ship would break through the ice. And so the reason that I show you this image is to think about what does it feel like to break through something that is very hard and difficult. What we see when we're looking on the surface of a picture like this is a really big, powerful ship that's moving through a body of water. And if we didn't have our sound on the video, or if we weren't standing on the shore watching it and hearing it firsthand, we wouldn't know that the noise is so loud. That noise is an indicator of what's happening below the surface, of how hard this ship is having to work to cut through these big layers of ice. These are ships that have huge front walls so that the ice can't crumple the metal. When we are looking at that, what does it really show us? To me, what that does is it makes me think about this image on the screen. It makes me think about, and I see a comment about, let me check something here before I tell you any more story about the ice and the breaker. Michelle, does that sound any better? I just changed a setting on my audio. Much better. All right, I got kicked in, I came out, it picked a different part of the headset. We're all learning. Thank you for letting me know. If anything else happens like that, please let me know. Oh, good. Resounding. Everybody's like, yes, Diane, better. Well, I hope you heard enough of the icebreaker story that this setup then for this image on the screen, the iceberg illusion, at least makes a little bit of sense. So like the Coast Guard icebreaker going through the St. Lawrence River in the Thousand Islands, what we see on the surface, we see this big majestic ship going along on the ice, just making the shipping channel open for the year. We think about that in grants. What do we see on the surface? We see grant money. Yay! celebration. We see pictures of people getting big checks and making award announcements on social media. What people see, yeah, that's great. But what's below the surface? For that ice-breaking ship, what's below the surface, you have no idea unless someone tells you how thick those front walls are for that ship. You have no idea how hard those engines are working to make sure that the ship is being propelled to move forward. When we think about our iceberg illusion as it relates to grants, what don't people usually see? They don't see that, you know what, we get a rejection email or a rejection letter and we might be sad for the moment, but we're going to pick ourselves up and keep going because we know that we'll get a yes. We know that the work we're writing about is meaningful, is impactful, and if we continue onward, we will find the grant maker that is the right fit for us. So do we persevere as grant-seeking professionals? People don't see the amount of research that it takes to learn about an upcoming federal opportunity, to read through the 96 pages of guidance, to pick up the phone and call foundations or call government program officers to ask questions before you apply. People don't see how hard it can be to pull together a group of stakeholders, a group of collaborative professionals to get the information you need for an application. What they see, well, they see the money, they see the success, they see the celebration. So what is it that we're looking for, this idea of a stressor versus a mistake? I mentioned that I like to have one good cup of coffee. A very large mug, I'll be honest, but it still counts as one. But I don't normally drink it anywhere near my laptop because I am prone to spilling things. If we were to spill iced tea, water, seltzer, coffee on the computer, the keyboard, you're right, that would be super stressful in the moment. But that's not something that we need to worry about in terms of a long-term issue for a grant rejection. We might just start doing what I do. I carry my Contigo everywhere so that even if I knock it over, I'm not going to hurt my tech. So that's a stressor, but not something big picture process-wise we want to worry about, something we'd learn from to maybe slightly minimize our rejections. What about the amount of time that is between when we decide to apply and when something is due? I think that this is actually one that is a bit of both. In any situation, this idea that we're going to apply for something that's due in just a very few number of days, single digit, this is going to be a stressor for you, the person who's writing the grant. It's going to be a stressor for those people who have to help provide information for the grant. And it might, if we're not careful, it might be a mistake on the organization's behalf to spend these short-term resources because we might not be competitive. I'm wondering if you feel comfortable letting me know in the chat box, why for yes? How many of you have ever had to write a grant, but you didn't know you were going to write the grant until literally just about a week before? Has that happened to anyone else in the room? Happened to me. Sometimes it's because the funder called or emailed and said, can you please submit this by close of business on Friday so we can consider you for a grant? Well, there's nothing we could have done to avoid that. We're going to do what we can to get it done in the most competitive way possible. But what I'm talking about on the screen are the times when something comes across email or is brought to your desk. Look at this opportunity. It seems like a great fit for us. Let's apply. And you look at it and the deadline is 6 days away, 7 days away, 8, 4, something that is single digits. That might be a mistake on the organization's behalf to say yes. It might rather be a strategic no, not now. The reason I highlight this one as a could be stressor, could be mistake, is because this situation is one where those who apply will likely have, overall in this situation, a higher rate of rejection than those that are approached without the heavy deadline pressure. So when we're thinking about our stressors versus our mistakes, we want to think about what are things we can do that make our process stronger, make our organization stronger in terms of grant readiness, not to ever completely get rid of grant rejections. My goodness, like I said, I wish I knew of such a thing, but to minimize the rejections where we might have a little bit of control. So what would be another stressor? How about sorting through either community needs assessment data or trying to figure out which data set you want to use out of the Census Bureau, or trying to figure out what you want to use for your local and then regional context and then national context, what you want to show for your comparative data. Anybody ever get lost reading different research reports and playing with the census tool? I know I have over time. As a sidebar, if you're ever feeling this stressor, there is a fantastic resource that helps with data comparison, and that is at datausa.io. I'm going to type that into the chat box for you right now. This is a great comparative tool if you're trying to manually think about how you're going to use different comparative levels of your data. This is a great free resource. The other thing I want to point out is that the Census Bureau has lots of free training related to how to best use their tracking tools so that you can pull information and data for your grant application. So if you're feeling this stressor, in order to help avoid rejection, right, to make sure that your data is as strong and as contextualized as possible, make sure you understand the great tools that are available to you at no cost. All right, so that's a stressor. Oh, now this one, hold on, this is a mistake. This is something that if we're not careful could lead to rejection. What I didn't highlight in my bio when I got started is that I began my career actually as a grant maker. I was a program officer for a statewide public foundation, the Michigan Women's Foundation. So I was in charge of grant making programs for the entire state of Michigan, and therefore was reading every single proposal that came in the door before it would get to our board committees. And I will tell you that I developed the habit very early on of reading the budget first. Before I read a single word of the narrative, I would read their budget documents first. And when this mistake that's on the screen, what this really presents as in an application is not that the number, the amount that you're asking for in the budget, that it doesn't align with what you said in the narrative, or it doesn't match your cover letter or your cover sheet. No, usually if you asked for 50 here, 50,000 was represented here. Or if you were talking about 25,000 on your cover sheet, the budget had $25,000. Those were usually in alignment. The mistake that can result in rejection if we're not careful is that the story that you're talking about in your narrative is not reflected in the budget. So for example, if you have just put forward in your narrative a concern that I'm going to make it a story about rural, since I mentioned them in the Thousand Islands, super rural community, no public transit. So if you're talking about reaching community members, there's not going to be a way that they can get to you. So you have to think about how you're going to get to them. So if you have just presented transportation in your rural community as a barrier for your community members accessing service, well, that probably means that if you're saying you're going to put staff in the community, drive directly to community member homes, what would we see in the budget? We would see a balancing part of the story. We would expect to see an expense related to the cost of staff driving in the community, going to community member homes. That, again, has nothing to do with our total ask. It has to do with the story that we've built in our narrative and what are the costs associated with achieving our design, addressing the need or the barriers that we have just laid out. That, to me, is an example of what this mistake could look like. We want to avoid it because this type of mistake makes reviewers kind of scratch their head, and it makes it harder for them to advocate on our behalf. When we think of stressors, online application portals, yep, they have their own category of stress that they can create. When we're looking at online portals, it seems like it's maybe 85% of our work these days is going into some sort of portal, either in little character counted or word counted boxes or as a single upload into a portal. Each portal is different, and they set guidance, maximums and minimums depending on the grant maker's preferences. It is stressful, 100%. It is stressful that if you are going to submit and you're putting in your responses and you click save and it says your response is too long, it exceeds the limit. Has that happened to anyone else here? Let me know in the chat box with your reactions if it has. That unfortunately has happened to me before. That's really stressful. Now here's the risk. If we're not careful, because we're so close to the deadline, if we're applying and putting things into the portal hours before a deadline, the day of the deadline, we might have a tech glitch. Something might go wrong. We might not be able to access the colleagues that should help us condense our response so it fits. So we might make some judgment calls on our writing on our own. If we have portal issues, it could jeopardize the submission as a whole. So to minimize this stressor and prevent it from becoming a potential mistake that would lead towards rejection, this is a very tactical suggestion, but we recommend that the minute you think you're going to apply, you log into the portal. Grab that preview. Look at what it says for how many characters it lets you have or how many words, but don't take it at face value. Test it. Grab something you've written before that you know is 2,000 characters or you know is 1,000 characters. Drop it into the portal and see what happens. Does its count agree with your count? Now you are stress-proofing and therefore probably mistake-proofing your overall submission process for this particular application. One last stressor or mistake type idea. This is mistake. And it's a mistake that can lead to an immediate rejection. If you as an applicant don't directly follow all of the instructions from the grant maker reserves the right to immediately say no thank you and to reject you. Now, I'm not saying that you would do that you wouldn't follow the guidelines, that you wouldn't follow their formatting requirements, but I just wanted to make it really clear that grant makers get so many proposals, always more proposals than they have dollars available to award, that if they can make a very quick judgment call based on like a technical eligibility component, templates that were used, formatting that was followed, if they can make an immediate no on technical eligibility, that's faster for their review process. All of a sudden that shrinks the pile that they have to consider. We don't want to have that happen. The way that we can avoid something like that happening is when we open a set of guidelines, whether it's a small set of foundation guidelines or a really big set of government guidelines, make a checklist related to the different formatting requirements. Is it double-spaced? Oh, that makes me think of every narrative ever written to OVW, the Office of Violence Against Women. Their narratives are always double-spaced. Well, I'll say almost always. I'm sure there's some exception somewhere. On the other hand, if we're working on something for SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, those aren't double-spaced. Those are single-spaced. So understanding what are the specific requirements for each grant maker and having a checklist that we, the grant writer or grant professional, can follow, but also have someone else on the team help work through, we can avoid, mistakes that give them an easy reason to say no. So how do we learn big picture from our rejections? These initial stressors versus mistakes, that conversation about what might be something, they all could stress us out, but some fit into the just generalized stressor category that don't influence a grant maker's decision. When we think about rejections, did you know that grant rejections are not 100% ever our responsibility? Did you know that there is so much more in the grant approval process that's happening that is outside of the walls of our organization, that is outside of our 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper? There is so much more that goes into the grant making decision, whether we're talking about foundation, city, state, federal. The only thing that we can 100% say is a direct line between what we do and whether we get funded or not is really the formatting guidelines. Everything else, there's a lot of factors that are outside of our control. So there will be times where we will learn we got rejected and we will learn why, and there would be nothing we could do differently. Now, on the flip side, there will be times where we get rejected and we're like, oh, that's a fair point. We knew that we could have written a stronger evaluation section, but we didn't have our evaluation partner yet. So it was a risk, and we lost some points for it. So we will learn what are some things that we can do differently? What are some ways that we can improve as an organization if we apply for the same program or to the same funder again? Now, I'm in my 40s, and so that means I grew up reading the books that were called Choose Your Own Adventure books. The idea being that you all started on the first page, but then you would quickly have something happen and you'd flip to a different spot in the book, depending on what adventure you wanted to have that day. Or you'd end up in 40 pages later. So the way that you would experience the book was really dependent on what you were feeling that day. So everyone had a slightly different adventure, although we may have started from the same first page. This handling of grant rejections, to me, has a similar feel. We start with the unfortunate grant rejection email, or maybe hard copy letter, or maybe the portal notification. So you got a rejection. Now, what do we do? First, we need to acknowledge that this hurts. This is hard. You individually, if you were the one leading the application, spent a lot of time and effort and put a lot of hard work into it. And so it's okay to reflect on how much that hurts. You thought you had it. We put in all that hard work. We wanted to see it succeed. Your team, your organization is probably also, they're having some feelings about it too. Already sad, maybe a little stressed about how we're going to continue a program or fund for the continuation of salary for something. Let's reflect, but quickly move towards, well, what's our action? What's our next step? What should we do now? So this is the start of our Choose Your Own Adventure book. The first thing that I want to have you do that is actionable after you've reflected and settled in on, okay, so we've learned that we were rejected, but we're going to grow from it. Now what? It's time to ask for feedback. I would love to hear from you. I'm going to put a quick little delineator here in the public chat box. How many of you have asked for feedback from a grant maker? Could be foundation, city, state, federal. How many of you have asked for feedback from a grant maker after you received a rejection notice? Could you let me know if you have? All right, great. I see that some of you have been asking for feedback. Now, some rejection letters will say, if you would like to debrief on the decision, please email us. Please call us. Saw one that said, if you want feedback, we will give you you can schedule a debrief and we will read you the feedback from your actual grant reviewers, but we won't provide you anything in writing. Saw one that said, we will provide you with a summary of your feedback, but not until the contracts are all awarded and approved for those who were funded in this round. So we're talking months from now. Saw a rejection one recently that said, we will give you your feedback within 30 days. But for us to give you the feedback within 30 days, you have to reply to this notice within 48 hours. So a lot of contingencies on whether or not you could access the feedback and how quickly you would get the feedback. Now, Lisa, you make a really good point in the chat, and I'm glad you brought it up because I was going to ask. My question to you was, have you asked for feedback? That's the outgoing communication. That's you to the funder. But does the funder say anything back? Lisa, it sounds like you've had that experience. No feedback. And so part of that is about the grant maker's capacity and preference. They're doing what they can to tell you you got rejected, because let's be frank, there are some grant makers that don't tell you whether or not they rejected you. They let it go into the great grant abyss. They figure, well, if they don't hear from us, they'll assume that it's a rejection. Ugh, don't like that, but that is what some, in particular, foundations will do. They don't have the capacity to notify all the people who submit proposals that they didn't fund them. They only tell those that they positively award money to. The same situation happens. Not all grant makers, when asked for feedback, will have the capacity, the ability to, or also the preference to give any sort of response. Not even a, we don't offer feedback. So we ask for feedback each and every time we get rejected because we're not sure what's going to happen. It is our best practice, though, that we should ask, because if we can get the feedback, that could help us. If we don't get the feedback, well, at least we asked. All right, in our Choose Your Own Adventure book, we are going to assume that we have asked for feedback and we've received some. In some format, the grant maker has given us some feedback. Well, what do we do with that feedback? You're right, we read it, we reflect on it. Here's what I'd ask you to consider. When you are getting that feedback from your funder, let's time warp back for a moment. Let's reflect back actually on our application process. So for the funder that you applied to, were rejected for in this moment, you asked for feedback, you got feedback. When you were getting ready to apply, did you ever reach out to that grant maker? Did you phone them? Did you email them? Did you meet them in person and have a chance to speak at a special event? If you did, you have a comparison point. What did it sound like? What do you remember from that conversation that was pre-application? And what does it sound like or feel like compared to the feedback that you received? The reason that that's important is that you're trying to probably decide, should we apply to this grant maker again in the future, or should we be done? If we had a nice, pleasant exchange in advance of applying, then we got feedback, and the feedback didn't have anything real negative in it. Maybe it said we really liked your program, but there just weren't enough dollars to go around this time. Well, now I've got 2 positive-ish interactions. I might want to try applying again. Whereas on the other hand, if we'd had an exchange before and the feedback said that there was some disalignment between my narrative and my budget, well, now I know what to work on to go back towards that positive conversation we had previously before an application. The other thing we can talk about, so we asked for feedback, we got feedback. Did we conduct any sort of internal review, peer review, mock review before we submitted? That's something that is not about a grant maker giving a review, but rather one of our team members, a collaborative partner, someone else that hadn't helped write it, giving you feedback. How do they think it's going to do it against the grant maker's criteria? If you did that process before you submitted, you got rejected though, you got your feedback. Now what you could do is look back at your mock review. Where were there weaknesses? Where were there areas for improvement that had been indicated in that proposal? Does it align with the feedback you heard from the grant maker? Oh, we made the reviewers basically do algebra in our budget justification. We didn't give them enough details. We made them basically solve for variables. We were making them try to figure out, how did we get these numbers? We didn't show them all of the elements for how we did our calculations. You know what? We didn't put the budget justification through the mock review process, just the main narrative. Okay, next time we'll remember that the entire application goes through mock review. We learned something important. It's not that looking back on our pre-award work will always highlight something that could be done differently moving forward, but it gives us a really nice full picture of what does our whole grant seeking strategy look like, and where might there be a spot where we could fine tune our process to make our next application stronger, especially for this specific funder you just got rejected from. Now, if you received feedback after reflecting on what things looked like pre-award, how closely did you stick to your best practices, what I'd recommend that you do is you take the feedback from the grant maker and you overlay it on your actual application. Okay, so the grant maker told us that they didn't think our objectives were smart enough. They weren't giving us a negative piece of feedback related to our intelligence. Rather, what were they talking about? They were talking about SMART objectives, the acronym: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. If the grant maker was making that comment about our objectives, they were saying something about our objectives was lacking. So now we would know to take that piece of feedback, we'd put it in our draft and say, okay, this whole section here, these 2 paragraphs about our objectives, how could we make them stronger in the future? Or maybe it's that we had a work plan and the work plan had the objectives laid out. All right, let's highlight those objectives in our work plan. The next time we have to do that, what could we do to make our objectives smarter for a future grant maker, especially if we were going to reapply to this grant maker? So the overlay, I kind of think about like layers, like if you were doing like graphic design, something in Canva or a tool like that where you could have layers. I like to place the feedback over the original text and the original attachments as an extra layer so that we can see where theoretically could we make changes moving forward. Questions, thoughts, feedback for me about this first adventure. You asked for feedback and you got it. Let me know if you have any questions in the chat box, or if you want to raise your hand, that would be fine as well. That's only part of our adventure. We've got to work our way back in the book and think about what happens, more like what Lisa said has happened. We got rejected. We asked for feedback. We didn't get any feedback. Silence. Nothing. Maybe you hit refresh on your email. You double check your sent inbox. Did that really go? You look back at your call log in your fundraising database. No, I said I left them a message 7 days ago. Nothing. What could we do then? So even though you did not get feedback, I would still recommend that you reflect back on your pre-award work. What did that look like? What did it sound like? Very often my team and I will get phone calls and emails from folks saying, we are looking to revamp the way we write about our programs. We're not getting as much funding as we think we should. We are getting rejected more often than we think we should. We need to revamp our writing. Oh, okay. Thanks for reaching out. Happy to talk to you. But before we have a single conversation about writing, can we talk about your best practices? Oh, sure. So the question then is, for the applications you've been submitting, let's just roughly reflect on the last year. How often are you reaching out, phone, email, in person, to a grant maker before you apply? Like roughly, how much are you doing? Now, you do not have to answer that question in the chat box unless you want to. But when I get these phone calls or these emails asking for revamping of writing, what we find is that often the pre-award best practices are a little more loosely applied than what we would recommend. So the reality is we want to reach out to all grant makers before we apply, unless they have told us not to. So if we feel like we're getting too many rejections, even if we're not getting feedback from the funder, one of the first things we should consider is how well are we applying the best practice of funder outreach, of funder relationships, before we are doing our writing work. Just like when we asked for feedback and we got feedback, we should also still reflect, asked for feedback, did not get feedback. We should look back and say, did we do any sort of internal review or peer review, a mock review before we clicked submit? While we don't have feedback to validate our responses, to say, oh, we were right on point, or oh, I guess we were a little too harsh or a little too nice in our responses in our review. If we did a review, we can think about, what did we find as spots we would want to improve? Do we think we could improve them and want to try again? So we could do some self-assessment in that space. You might say, oh, Diane, no, we didn't know to do an internal review, a peer review, a mock review, anything like that before we submitted. Well, this might be a moment then where you can make a process improvement, especially for government grants, that could minimize your future rejections. So mock review toolkit, image on the screen here, that is one of your course materials. I'm probably going to say it backwards for where you go. I'll say the wrong thing for where you click. But don't press the red button or the red bar. Don't do it because you'll leave the webinar. But after today, once we're done with the webinar, when you're back in your courses section and there's the materials related to the course, our mock review toolkit as a PDF is there for your use. So if this is something new to you, you 100% could take that and try it as a process improvement, especially with large government grants, to minimize future rejections. You might say, oh, okay, so path 1, you got rejected and you asked for feedback and you got it. Path 2, you asked for feedback after you got rejected, you didn't get feedback. That's it, just 2 paths, right? There is a third adventure path that I want to highlight. One of the things that many really awesome, well-intentioned and seasoned grant professionals forget to think about, because you're so busy celebrating, is to ask for feedback when you get funded. So you get an award letter, you get an award email, you get an award notice from a portal. First thing you probably do, grab the yellow smiley dingy bell or your team's equivalent of what you do for celebration. I'm with you. That's the first thing. Let's celebrate and make sure everyone knows how excited we are. We got the grant. But you know what? I actually believe that there is more to learn in a positive way that's going to strengthen our grant seeking strategies about how we can replicate success than worrying about how can we avoid failure. Each reviewer is different. Each set of guidelines is different. The people that we are competing against in each process are different. But if we found a positive piece of feedback because we got funded. That means people were excited. If we heard how strong our budget justification was, how nice and clear it was, no one felt like they had to go for their calculator. If we heard how crisp and clean and smart our objectives were, that they weren't just smart, but in fact, they were smarty, the I and the E that I just added in the chat box, inclusive and equitable. If we heard feedback like that from grant makers, let's try to do that more. It is easier, there's no such thing as easy in grants. It is easier for us to replicate the success of where we've had positive feedback from different reviewers than to stress and worry about the nuances of little places we might have lost a point here and there. So asking for feedback when you get an award, I think this is actually the most meaningful feedback that helps us avoid future rejection. Now, I would love to give you the opportunity in the public chat section of the tool to humble brag for a moment. How many of you already consistently ask for feedback when you get funded? You get the award letter, you celebrate, and then after you say, thank you so much, we're so grateful for the award, how many of you ask for feedback? Go ahead, Y for yes, if you are consistently doing that. It's easy to let that step slip by because first we celebrate, woo, and then we get right to work, focusing on implementation and who's going to be in charge of reporting and are the reports on the calendar? How are we going to spend the money? Is finance clear? Do we have code set up? We get right into the project management of being a grantee. Now there's plenty more to this session still today, but if there is one action, one thing that you consider changing based on today's topic, I would ask you to consider this. Make it a habit. Make it part of your checklist. You get an award, what do? You get an award, celebrate, then ask for feedback. You did the things really well. The grant maker liked it. The reviewers liked it. You probably scored well if you were formally scored. How can you do it again? I care more about this than about what they said for why you just barely missed by a point or two. I will climb off the little soapbox I had that I was standing on here related to asking for feedback when you got funded. We'll come back to the other side. Let's think about challenges. So when we are working through our process of seeking grants, there are some pretty common themes for organizational situations that result in rejections. So I thought, well, what if we kind of grouped some of them together so that we could talk through some of these potential concerns or challenges, so that if you find yourself in the midst of one of these, you might say, wait, this feels challenging. It feels like we could be, if we're not careful, headed for a rejection. What could we do differently? I'll give you a moment to kind of think about some other alternatives. So the first, it feels like as a team, grant team, as a program team, or as an organization, you're trying to think about how to get started. Got to get this ball rolling. Maybe you're hearing things like, hey, are there any low-hanging fruit, things that we could do as we're getting started? What this might sound like in an organization, and it happens in different organizations in different times. It happens if there are new people in the role of grant seeking. It happens if there's new people in the role of a development director. It happens if there are new people in the role of organizational leadership. So things are new teams, either for you or for others. What that can mean is that you or someone else then within the organization have inherited someone else's strategy. This is what it means. This is what it looks like for us to seek grants. Or it might be, well, I'm coming in and I'm not sure what I'm inheriting. I'm not sure what the last leader thought or if I agree with it. So actually it feels like there's a lot of gray It's kind of foggy. I'm not real sure what it might look like. But I know we need to get grants, and we feel the pressure that we have to get grants. We've got to keep things rolling. So what might we do to gain control in this situation and not let the angst of getting started, establishing a new strategy, confirming what is it that different leaders want us to go after, what is it we can do to avoid rejection in the short term? So some tactical ideas. Having a shared grant calendar. Whenever there is any sort of staffing or leadership change, grant readiness in an organization, it's shaken up. And so systems that may have been in place before, may have worked for one person's personal project management or calendar management approach, might not work for the current group. So we have to ensure that there is a shared grant calendar where not just one person, but the team, those that have a stake in seeing grants be successful, can see what are the upcoming deadlines, not just for actual requests for funding, but for reports as well. Unfortunately, I've seen examples where organizations have gone through a staffing transition, a report deadline was missed, and as a result, the next request for funding was rejected. We want to avoid that by having this shared calendar for the overall deadlines for requests for funding, but also include on them all of our reports, the things that it takes for us to be a good grantee. And in addition to that, think about any sort of stewardship beyond reports that are required. If we put it on our calendar as a general rule, those are the things that we are prioritizing as individuals in our organizations. We prioritize right or wrong based on what we see on our daily calendar. It says I should go to these 4 meetings today. So that's my priority that I can see. And so I react to that. What's the other thing we all react to as priorities? Yeah, our inbox. I don't want that one though. But if it's on our calendar, that is often, as a reminder, what will help bring that to the forefront for our day. So we want deadlines, reports, and other forms of stewardship. If we can get those on a shared calendar, it's not that we have to do all the things, but we can help prioritize it for our team. When we're not quite sure, we're in this getting started, it feels kind of angsty again, whether it was that we're new or there's leadership, different team members who have changed that are different. We want to make sure that we have read our recent proposals. That if it was us, well, we're going to read all the things. If you're coming in as a new grant professional, let's read all the different ways that we have been describing the work as an organization. If you have a new development director or you have a new executive director, you want to ask them to read some of the recent things. Just recently, we were working with a large community center and they had an executive director that was brand new to the organization. And then 3 months later, they had a brand new development director. So there was the past success in terms of what had been written and what had been awarded. But there was some change afoot in terms of what sort of language and what sort of storytelling did they want to see used moving forward. You didn't want to completely turn the organization upside down and confuse long-term funders about who were they and how were they describing themselves, which would have been the risk in that situation. So they needed to read, what have we said before? What have we sounded like before? How can we make positive future transitions in the way we want to describe our work and evolve who we are? So understanding what has been said in the past makes this last one possible. When someone in the organization's grant team, again, grant team is people that have a stake in seeing grants be successful. If you are the one that's new, as the grant seeker, you can call or email and say, hi, wanted to introduce myself. I'm new in this role, looking forward to continuing to work with you and implementing the funded projects. New development directors, new executive directors, absolutely, funders should be on their list. This is why I just told you that story about though having them read recent things that have been written so that they're able to use those as talking points about what has happened to date. And then sure, they can share some updated vision for where they might want to head. What's the funder's reaction to where they might be? So yes, they're getting started in the moment, but we don't want to forget what was the history. What was it that got us to this place? So the getting started, pretty broad bucket because it's not just about us as the grant seekers, it also involves other members of the team. When we think about other common organizational growth challenges, things that can lead, if we're not careful, to rejections, the pressure for needing money now can lead grant applications astray. Does anyone feel the pressure? You don't have to raise your hand for this. To find grant money now? It's a pretty constant pressure in many organizations. But the reality is that grants are slow money. Yet the organization, I should say, has immediate needs. So when we're thinking about our timing, what are we asking for? What is it that we need? When are we going to spend the money? What will we report on? We need to listen for what our colleagues are telling us. We absolutely need cash flow support. We need money to pay for payroll next month. We need money in order to pay for the windows that are leaking right now, causing damage. Those are all short-term things. Those are not easy things for grants to fix. We might have a fantastic relationship with a grant maker who is willing to make some immediate, very fast decisions to support us, but that is the exception, not the rule. And so when we're thinking about those immediate needs, the things we're hearing, we need grants to do this right now, the underline of the now, the flashing lights around now. Well, if we ask for grants for things that are literally now, unless it is that rare exception of a grant maker who knows the organization already so well, it is an easy rejection for grant makers because their processes are slow. They're not going to fund something that is in the past. They're going to fund something that's in the future. They want to fund your impact. And while, yes, your immediate now needs will address long-term impact, that is not the way that grant makers think about making funding awards. Now, saying all of this, I do recognize that there are times when we think about, my goodness, severe weather, emergencies, and short-term immediate community needs. That's a big exception to what I'm saying right here. That's a now that then people do make immediate emergency grant awards to. I'm talking though in the big picture, the majority of the time, grant makers are worried about the future impact. And so your now needs, they're too close. Donors are the ones most likely to think about your now needs. Grant makers are thinking about your 3-month needs, your 6-month needs, your 12-month needs. They want you to look further out. So if you're hearing a lot of now, we need this now, try to shift the conversation by returning to the idea of a calendar again. So here's what we're looking at. I hear what you need now, but right now what I need is to know, well, what do you need in 6 months? I need to get ahead of the now. I need to get ahead of that and understand what are we writing for in the future. Might also be helpful as an organization to utilize some sort of decision-making matrix or a flow chart for how you make decisions about what types of things you'll apply for. Because if there's too much pressure in the organization to apply for the now, your risk for rejection, if you're applying only for the now, the risk for rejection will go up, which gives grants a bad name. We want to make sure we're applying for things that do stand a chance at being successful, and most of the time that's forward-looking. So not our immediate now, our future looking. One thing to consider is a question that you might ask grant makers. So thinking about our pre-award process before we're writing, when we're doing research about our grant makers, how long does it take for them to make a decision? Some grant makers, if they have a website or within their guidelines, might be very transparent about how long the process is. Others, they don't tell you much, but it's a fair question to ask. If we're submitting a grant today, so October 1st, if we submit a grant today, how soon do you expect to notify recipients that they have been awarded funds? Maybe they'll tell you end of the calendar year. Maybe they'll tell you, oh, well, we don't look at things that are today. We don't look at those until our April board meeting. So we don't actually send out grant award agreements till like May. Oh, all right. Well, that's a long time from now, but at least you know. So you're focusing on the right future later by doing that. You just don't know how long it will take. I just saw one of the fastest federal decision-making timelines in a while. OVC, Office on Violence Against, nope, gonna get it wrong. We'll just go with OVC for the moment. They were accepting applications. It was something that was just due here at the end of the summer. Award announcements came out this week. I sort of rubbed my eyes. I'm like, really? That was far less than even 60 days for a federal decision. So we don't want to assume just because of the type of entity how long the wait time will be. But if it's not clear in the process, I do encourage you to ask. It's a fair question. All right, so what else could we see or hear in our organizations? Things that might lead to rejections, things that we want to try and work our way through now before they turn into a rejection. So these goldfish, the goldfish in the left-hand fishbowl, they're great goldfish. They could make fantastic pets. But does everybody see the fish that's leaping from the bowl on the left to that bowl on the right? That is a very special fish. I'm not sure how it learned how to leap out of the bowl, but there it goes. It wants to be in the bowl on its own. Because if you've ever gone to a pet store, or maybe you have your own fish tank and you're trying to catch a particular fish, that's tricky. But you're going to probably catch one. Well, if you're in this fishbowl on the left-hand side, think about that as a stack of qualified grant applications. There's some really good things in there. The grant maker's not exactly sure which one they're going to fund. Depend on the day, depend on the mood, depend on the caffeination, depend on who else is reviewing, but they know they're going to fund some good stuff. But that goldfish that leapt to the bowl on the right, if you walked into the room and you're like, oh, look at that one, I want that goldfish. I'm going to scoop that one right up. If you're reading proposals, and this happens in every process I've been a reviewer for 20 plus years, and you're reading all the proposals and you're like, oh, this one is fantastic. Everybody in the room has their absolute yes. And when there is agreement on which one is the absolute yes, that is a nice, fast process for that part. Then everybody spends time debating over the rest of the potentially fundable applications. So if you're not sure if your proposals are really standing out from the crowd, you're not getting a lot of really great big feedback, you're not necessarily seeing all the awards that you think you should, that might look a little bit like these examples on the screen. If you're getting lots of generic rejection letters and emails, you're asking for feedback, you're not getting any feedback. There's true uncertainty about why you're being denied. You're not sure what it is that's going to help you stand out. You may very well, they're not telling you you're doing something wrong, but they're not telling you that you're doing things right. So you might be hanging out in that fishbowl with all those great fish that could be pets. You're in that stack with all those proposals that could be great grants. How can you stand out? I love data. To make empirical decisions, oh, it gives me such joy. Now, when we think about grant metrics, you might say, oh, really? That's going to bring you great joy? Oh, it does. I love to watch the trends for different organizations about their grant data. If we are looking back over time, could any of you tell me for your organization what has happened to your success rate for grants over the last 3 to 5 years? If so, please do stand up, well, safely. Stand up on your chair if you want. Put your hands up in the air. Give me some sort of reaction in your status here in the tool. If you are able to look back on your data, whether, I'm not saying you know the numbers by heart, you don't have to tell me the numbers, but you know you could use Grant Hub and look back, or you could look at your spreadsheet and go back and tell me what are my trends for my grant award percentage, or what are my trends for my grant rejections, or what are my trends for my numbers for how many I renew or how much I increase. Understanding overall, where does this rejection fit? Helps you to think about what are we learning, how are we growing as an organization? You might say, I'm not getting a lot of feedback, but over time, we've actually been applying for more grants year over year. We've been slowly growing our grant seeking strategy. And when we don't get funded, we rarely get feedback. Wish we did. But over time, my award rate is climbing. I'd say, well, okay, so I get it. None of us want to be rejected. But if over time, if your award rate is climbing, I would rather look at what are the types of grant makers that you are getting the rejections from? Is it in foundation space? Is it in government space? Is it in local government space? Is there a trend for where you're getting rejected? Because it might be that you're really good at standing out with one type of grant maker, and now you've narrowed it down that there's a particular type of grant maker where you could do some more work if you want to continue to apply for funds there. So the data can help you to see a much bigger picture instead of only one rejection. I could talk about using data to make empirical big picture decisions like this and try some ideas. Now, we would need a separate 90 minutes for that today. So please be sure if you want to kind of play with your backwards looking dashboard, I'd be happy to talk about it more offline if you want. Another thing, if you're contemplating and questioning, are we standing out or are we kind of stuck in this fundable place, this fishbowl of could be nice pets, could be great grantees, but not standing out? We should probably take a look at our grant seeking procedures, standard operating protocols. Do we have any at all in place that tell us these are the things we do to decide if we're going to apply and how we're going to reach out and how we're going to get approval for submission? Maybe if you want to let me know, show of hands, how many of you have some form of policy or procedure related to the process of seeking grants? It might be a formal SOP that you've got somewhere in the organization. It might be a checklist of things that you as an organization do. You want to let me know if any of you have policies in place, procedures in place related to your grant seeking work? I get it. There's plenty of policies and procedures in place for organizations related to big picture things, time off and compliance within the state or the states where you're working. The idea of the grant seeking policy or process, Candace, so happy to hear that you have some, is so that especially in times of transition, we have an agreed upon structure that we follow. This is what we say our best practices are as an organization for who weighs in when and how we get approvals and how we submit so that we don't accidentally skip a step. One of those steps is actually if we're thinking about the grant life cycle. The grant life cycle, it's become very popular industry jargon for some of our best practices. And there's 5 R's that fit in that life cycle. We've talked about some of these R's already. Actually, most of them. Readiness, research, relationships, writing, and reporting. When we look at our grant life cycle items and we're trying to think about what does that mean, how does that influence the way we stand out, we want to be sure that we're doing everything we can to stand out, not just in our writing work, but anytime we might interact with a grant maker. Where does that most likely fall a little flat? Grant maker relationships. For the same reason I mentioned in an earlier, like, right? If we were trying to get started, what does it sound like? Are we calling grant makers before we apply? Are we trying to talk to them? Grant maker relationships are a common, so don't feel bad if this is a spot where you're like, oh yeah, this isn't our strongest spot. This is a common spot where organizations who are seeking grants can turn up the dial a little bit, up the ante. Grant maker relationships, well, they're critical because it's people making grants to people. Now, you're right. Not all grant makers are going to want to hear from us. No, some will say, you can't call us. Don't email us. Don't want to hear from you. Sometimes it's really hard to find out who is on their board. Therefore, it's hard to play like the different degrees of connection. Who on your board might know someone on their board. And so when we think about our relationships and how we reach out and when and how, who's going to say it, who feels comfortable, it's okay that it's actually a different answer for different grant makers. It might be that an executive director has a super strong connection to funder A and B, and the development director has a connection to funder C, and funder D, well, no one knows anyone there, and so you as the grant writer, the grant professional, you get to make a relationship. You get to do the outreach. That's okay. But one of the things that we found to be really helpful is that especially if you have an engaged board of directors or an advisory committee of some sort, if you can present them the list of the individuals who are part of that grant-making organization, either board or committee, now instead of saying, do you know anyone at the Diane Leonard Foundation? Now you can say, do you know anyone on this list that is involved in the Diane Leonard Foundation? You're much more likely to get a response if you can give them the list, the actual names of the people you're looking for a connection to. One of our favorite ways to let board members or leadership or advisory council members use that list is if they're active on LinkedIn, ask them if they'll search for some of the folks on there. See if they have a connection to them if they don't initially recognize any of the names. Now, unanswered questions for reviewers, that'll get you every time. That is a spot. Not that grant makers then negatively advocate against a proposal, but unanswered questions for reviewers will lead to probably quiet in the Zoom room or in the physical review room when people are talking about what should be funded. If they have questions about your data, is this their opinion that they're telling us, or according to whom? Is this like Census Bureau? Where did this data come from? If the objectives don't have strong measurement components, or if they are not time limited, or if it doesn't feel like the objectives are really relevant to the overall goal for the program, those are things that leave the reviewers, again, kind of scratching their head. And they're unlikely to give you a top score, or if it's not a scored application, to speak up and advocate on your behalf. Some of the things that we can do to avoid unanswered questions, it's hard to predict all the questions that they might have, but one thing we can do is draft SMART objectives in advance. If your programs, if your services are, for the most part, consistent, Sure, you will make changes over time based on community needs, but if the general core ideas, the goal and the objectives that you think you're going to try to achieve for a program or for a service stay the same, you can draft your SMART objectives in advance. So then what you're doing is making some minor changes based on maybe character and word limit. So that can take some of the pressure off of the deadline and give you a chance to get feedback from others before you would click submit. It's really helpful if you have an organizational style guide. What type of citation do you do? Do you go for footnotes, APA style, if footnotes are allowed? Or do you always prefer in-text citation? Do you use an Oxford comma or not? What acronyms do you use as an organization? And are you sure that you always spell them out the first time that you use them? Small details, but things that can make it easier and less frustrating for a reviewer to read. As a sidebar, I am Team Oxford comma. It definitely, serial commas definitely lead to clarity for reviewers. I'm also Team please don't use acronyms because they frustrate reviewers. And they make reviewers flip back and forth to figure out what did the acronym mean the first time it was used. So those are two items that I feel pretty strongly about, but yes, food for thought for your own organizational style guide. I mentioned the portal before, and when we think of the portals, the reason that they can cause such stress in organizations is that there's pop-ups. These custom portals, you pick yes, and all of a sudden there's 4 new questions. And then you're like, wait a second, where'd my colleagues go? I need their help so that I can get this answered. And so those last minute responses are, while they could be technically accurate, they could be grammar error free, they are rarely the most competitive responses that you could have put together because you were under the pressure of time and deadline. So what we want to avoid are those portal uh-ohs. So getting in early, checking not only those character counts, like I mentioned before with the stressor, but populating, and I get it, now we're like fake populating a portal, which could be a risk that we might accidentally submit. So we have to carefully test, are there any drop downs that might produce additional text responses? Because that might put far more pressure on us and all of our colleagues than what we can successfully respond to in a short period of time. There is one additional part to this, though. We don't want to submit on the day of the deadline, ever, for so many very, very stressful reasons. But the more we prepare to submit 3 days before, 4 days before, 5 days before, well, then you do indeed have a little bit of wiggle room if there is a truly unforeseen drop down, extra text box. Or if there is something about the tech that just doesn't seem quite right. Why did you get locked out of the portal again? And why is it that their foundation, I won't name the name of the foundation in New York State, that manually resets your password? These are the things that are so stressful that if we wait till the day of the deadline, we might get something in, we might just write our own rejection letter, right? That's the risk that's happening when we deal with day of deadlines. So when we're trying to get ready in advance, I actually encourage you to think about your organizational policies and procedures from a slightly different metric-driven way. We were talking about what are your metrics for your trends, your award rates, your rejection rates, look at them by different types of grant makers. Is anyone currently calculating how many days in advance of submission they're submitting applications, an average days in advance calculation? Our writing team does, and it's fascinating to watch. It's not that most days you're not usually submitting things that are 30 days in advance, 20 days in advance. There was an 18-day though recently, and there was a 9, and there was an 11, and there was a 5, and there was a 4. And what it ends up creating as a feeling for the team as a vibe is actually, if you think to workplaces that are more like if they're OSHA focused, how many days without a workplace accident? So think like a construction site like that, and you've got the signs and you walk through and say 0 days since our last accident. You're like, oh, 54 days since our last accident. You're like, yes, yes, that's fantastic. Keep going. Your team starts to generate that feeling. How high can we continue to raise our average days in advance of submission? How many days, how many weeks, how many months since our last day of submission? That is something to be really proud of. And honestly, submitting in advance does ultimately breed more success in your grant seeking strategy as opposed to rejection. So some food for thought. These are some of the most common questions. I'm not sure if they're your exact questions, but I thought I'd put them here to start you get you started on the Q&A topics. If you have questions about learning from grant rejections, you can type them into the public chat right now. But here's one that I commonly hear. This will get us started. How many times should you apply and be denied before you decide to stop applying to that grant maker or opportunity? Well, if you're thinking about it and your answer is, I don't know, Diana, it depends, I agree. Some folks carry a 3 strikes and you're out rule, sort of like baseball. Others say, oh, absolutely, I'm planning to apply a few times. It's NSF. Very rare to get funded by NSF on your first time in. It's probably going to be 3 or 4 times. I'm in it for the long game here. Others might say, twice. I'm going to try once. If I get feedback, I might try a second time. If I try once and I get no feedback, I might not try again. Situational, for sure, based on where do you get feedback? What do you know about the funder or the field as a whole? So it depends. All right, so maybe that was one of your key questions. If you have questions, I'm keeping an eye on the chat box for you. How do we focus on continuous improvement within the grant seeking process, within our grant writing skills? A lot of what I've talked about here is reflecting on process, learning from success. Yes, learning from failures, but learning from our successes, building on those. So one thing, the time that you're taking for webinars right here, that's an important step towards building your overall capacity, focusing on reducing your rejections. I really encourage you to take a look at the Grant Professional Credential. The Grant Professional Certification Institute is who leads that credential. I'm not saying in no way does the credential make it so you don't get rejected. Specifically, they have competencies that are there. There's 9 of them. And they cover the best practices in our work. I would encourage you to take a look at those competencies and think about which one do I want to strengthen in the next 6 months or in the next year. So that rather than being overwhelmed by trying to strengthen all the best practices all at the same time, pick the one that you want to prioritize and then focus your learning on that. Then webinars, yes, but like, look, books, love making grant related book recommendations. Podcasts, oh, do I have recommendations there too? Right? There's so many great different ways to learn and think about how not just you want to learn more about grants, but what might feel right for sharing with a board member or your executive director or with a colleague. Be sure to share the resources that you're using to learn and grow your grant seeking skills with those around you. Now, this is my favorite question that comes up because I talked about success earlier. How is it that you are celebrating success? I like to see teams celebrating success for far more than grant awards. Don't get me wrong, grant awards are absolutely 110% worthy of celebration, but I like to see you celebrating more. So what is it you do to celebrate now? You already have seen my yellow dingy bell today. Got one on the screen for you too. I know some teams have specific emojis that they use in their chat channels when they have good things happen. I know a team that when they meet their goals, their short-term goals as a team, they have a random, it looks like the wheel is a Wheel of Fortune wheel. It's a randomized wheel that spins online and has small little team celebrations. Playing a team song off the playlist, taking 15 minutes of quiet time during the day, taking 15 minutes for meditation at the beginning or end of the day in a way that's meaningful for them. Different ways to celebrate when something positive happens related to grant seeking. Girl Scout cookies in the office kitchen. Morning bagels for the monthly grant team meeting. Try to find ways to celebrate your success as a team beyond the grant award. There's lots of great, amazing things happening as you're learning and you're growing. Celebrate them so that that's what you're focused on growing and learning from. Yes, rejections still might happen. Like I said, I've yet to find a way to completely avoid them. But they become more of a blip. All right, we learned what we could from the feedback. We're going to continue to move on with our strategy. We know we're strong. We know we're doing the right thing. You can't win them all. There's a lot in the decision process that is outside of our control. So I hope some of those questions that I had pre-thought of based on what people often ask helped with some of your questions. I'm checking out the public chat, but I don't see anything else there. So you are welcome to email me questions after the fact or to connect anywhere that you feel comfortable on social media if you would prefer instead. I want to say thanks for being with us in the webinar. Thanks for being active in the chat. Appreciate you so very, very much.
Thank you so much for this incredible presentation, Diane. What a way to kick off the new online platform that we're using. Folks, I've gone ahead and put quite a few links into the chat for you. So the first one that's in there is the link that you should bookmark so that you can easily log back into the online platform for the next webinar. The next one down is the registration link that you can share with your friends and colleagues so that they can also register to be on the platform. The third is a link to our new Cathedra webinars archive that's now on our YouTube channel. And then the final one is a link to today's webinar feedback survey. We do hope you can complete that for us. It just takes a minute or two, lets us know what's working well, what we can improve upon for the future. And it is anonymous, so feel free to be as candid as you would like. And our next webinar is going to be next week on the 8th. This is going to be law enforcement, mitigating hazards, preparing for and responding to emergencies, and recovery strategies. This is actually going to be the first webinar in a 4-part series presented by Will Latchford. Since y'all are already part of the online platform, you will not need to register. You will automatically be added to the course, and then you'll just log in like you did today during the webinar time, and you will see that green banner at the top of your screen, and you'll be able to join because it's coming soon to a Cathedra near you. I had so much fun making this. But our standard webinar times are not going to change. So 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain, 11 a.m. Pacific, and 10 a.m. Alaska. That link is in the public chat for you. Again, all of our webinar archives have shifted over now to our YouTube channel, so we hope you will still check out our recordings. Please also check out our upcoming events posted to our various social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and we do have our in-house produced podcast, the Hope of Being a Native American podcast, where we go into more micro topics within tribal housing and self-determination. You can listen to that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Simplecast. And if you like to watch the videos with our guests, then you can check that out on our YouTube channel as well. But otherwise, y'all, thank you so much for coming on today. I'm so happy you were able to successfully join the webinar. We know there's going to be a few hiccups along the way as everybody gets used to this new system. But I would say today was a smashing success, and we're just so happy that all of you could be a part of it. Thank you, Diane, for an incredible presentation, and thank you to everybody who's here for your time. All right, y'all, I am going to go ahead and close out the webinar, but thank you so much for your time. The recording is going to be available in the actual course. And like Diane said earlier, the resource item that she included for you, that is also available for download, that mock review guide. All right, folks, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or concerns. Have a great rest of your day.